Good morning, afternoon, or evening to everyone joining us today. On behalf of USAID and Resilience Links, I welcome you to our theme-month webinar on food security and conflict integration. I am Shantice McCorkle with Resilience Links. Before we begin, let me orient you to the Zoom platform. On the bottom of the screen, you'll see most of your controls. First, if you haven't done so already, please use the chat to introduce yourself. To ask questions throughout the webinar, please use the Q&A button. And lastly, we are recording this webinar and we will email you the post-event resources shortly following the event. You can also find the resources on resiliencelinks.org. Thank you for your attendance today. We can go to the next slide. Today's agenda is as follows. We will have opening remarks and introductions. We'll then have the Feed the Future Toolkit conflict integration. We will talk about livelihoods for resilience, lessons learned from Ethiopia's northern conflict, what works for resilient food security in conflict settings, and then we will have a moderated panel and open Q&A. And we can go to the next slide. Today's speakers are Jessica Anderson, Senior Conflict Advisor with USAID Center for Resilience, Elizabeth Farmer, Chief of Party, CARE, Ethiopia, Livelihoods for Resilience Activity, and Olga Petrniak, Senior Director, Resilience Portfolio of Mercy Corps. I'll now hand it over to Jessica.
Awesome, Shantice, thank you so much. So on behalf of USAID Center for Resilience, we are very grateful to this platform, the Resilience Links platform, and to everyone for joining us. And I'm really excited to dive into today's event. So the Feed the Future Toolkit on conflict integration that I'll be sharing has been in the work for 18 months. This has for sure been a work in progress. And one goal for this event is to launch and share this toolkit with all of you as a resource. But with that, I want to make it clear that today's topic extends well beyond the US government's Feed the Future initiative. You know, big picture, we know conflict and food systems are inextricably linked. And I think we all recognize that conflict can cause a lot of harm. You know, it drives crises, it undermines resilience, it can erode development progress. But on the other hand, there's opportunity. So we know the better we understand the connections between conflict and food systems, the better we can build resilience and meet our food goals while also contributing to a more peaceful world. So that's a bit on why this topic matters, but I'm actually going to take a few minutes and we can head to the next slide to lay out what's at stake here just a little bit more. And we can head to the next slide as well. So this is a bit of a loud slide, right? And I think it really showcases that over the past year, the relationship between food and conflict has been in our headlines. This isn't some minor topic on the margins. We have the war in Ukraine, we have a global food crisis, and then there's a hunger crisis in the Horn of Africa driven by a mix of climate change and conflict factors. So we know just based on our newspapers that this topic really matters today. And I would say the current crisis is important and heartbreaking. But I'd also like to suggest that beyond these headlines, and unfortunately, fragility and violence are nearly everywhere, including within and throughout our food system. And we can head to the next slide. So I'm just going to share a couple statistics on the global picture here. One is hunger is on the rise for the first time in decades with conflict as a key driver. And the number of people living in conflict is on the rise too. And you can see that in the figure on the left. Now, if you look at the chart on the right, these fragile and conflict affected places are ripe for acute food crises. And Feed the Future is actually focused in a number of these countries, from target countries that are in yellow here to aligned countries that have a red box around them. And we can head to the next slide. Now, this is another noisy slide, but the point here is that today's compounding crises are steadily becoming the norm. They are generating spiraling humanitarian need and funding shortfalls. We simply do not have the resources we need to meet today's challenges. And yeah, and you can see this with the graphic in bold, when we invest in resilience and developmental approaches in these places, we see that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And I would argue it's both a moral and strategic imperative to lean into these places, these challenging contexts, with developmental approaches that are bringing things like markets, systems approaches, longer term approaches, various kinds of opportunity to places that might otherwise be written off. But it isn't enough to just go to some of these geographies. And with that, there's so many different kinds of conflict and violence and fragility, but in general, investing in these more challenging contexts, it's not enough in and of itself. That this entails that we need to work differently. Really understanding how to integrate conflict across our work in order to be successful is key. And this is where the toolkit comes in, as well as the amazing programming examples we're going to be hearing from our speakers. So we can head to the next slide again. Now, what is exciting is that 1 week ago now, exactly 1 week ago, USAID launched its new Feed the Future Toolkit on conflict integration. This is a massive resource. It is 100+ pages that will also be part of a new conflict integration page on the Resilience Links website with additional resources and guidance. So the toolkit is a really excellent first port of call, but there will be a variety of ways, including the website, to take pieces of the toolkit and other resources and make it really accessible and user-friendly. This toolkit was developed in partnership with Duke University. I am very grateful to our collaboration with Duke on this. I know some are in the audience today, so thank you very much to our Duke colleagues on the line. Now, some very quick background. I think Feed the Future is probably familiar to many folks, but Feed the Future is the US government's global hunger and food security initiative. Now, there's a new strategy behind this initiative, the Global Food Security Strategy, which was launched this past fall for 2022 to 2026. And it guides this 1 billion+ initiative, and it now includes a cross-cutting goal on conflict integration, which is very exciting. But the rubber then needs to hit the road. So importantly, this toolkit provides that. It takes us from having an overarching goal to practical steps and ways of operating that can really move the needle on how we're engaging in fragile, conflict-affected, and violent places. And like I said before, even though I'm mentioning Feed the Future, that's just to help frame where this product came from. This toolkit can be useful for anyone interested in conflict integration and food systems. Okay, so now I will get into just a bit what is in this toolkit, and we can head to the next slide. So I will quickly go through this. I think someone telling you what's in a product is not the most inspiring content during a webinar, so I will strive to do this quickly. But one thing that the toolkit does is really dig into the relationship between conflict and food systems. So you'll get the pitch on why this relationship matters so much and how. And really that punchline I shared earlier, that the better we understand the connections between conflict and food systems, the better we can meet our Feed the Future goals or just food goals generally, while also contributing to a more peaceful world. But after that intersection, which also digs into key concepts like conflict sensitivity, conflict integration, key definitions, we then march through the program cycle and offer really practical guidance, tools, and resources on things like developing a conflict-sensitive theory of change, activity design, implementation, MEL, and then throughout you'll see examples from distinct contexts. So Kenya and Honduras specifically are weaved in throughout, and you'll get sort of in-depth examples and diagrams on particular food system topics, like for instance, seed systems, nutrition-specific interventions, livelihoods programming. Now, after that, there is a really robust section on resilience and conflict. So for folks familiar with Feed the Future, resilience is a core objective of Feed the Future and the GFSS. And this section digs into the resilience framework, which looks at risk more broadly. And it can be helpful for thinking about what it means to think about conflict alongside these other compounding risks that people are facing in their lives, like climate change or a pandemic. The next section we have then is a lot of programming examples. So these are from diverse scenarios and conflict drivers. They look at things like resource conflicts, lack of public trust, political exclusion, weak social cohesion, lack of economic opportunity, a whole range of problems from fragile, conflict-affected, and violent contexts, where we have really interesting and innovative programming examples that seek to address them. And then finally, We have mission case studies. So this is especially useful, we hope, for USAID folks. These focus on how conflict has been integrated across a portfolio at the country level. So this moves up from that programming level set of considerations and looks at things like approaches to organizational structures, training, high-level strategy documents, sort of all of these different aspects that go beyond the specific program. And we can head to the next slide. Now, because there is a lot of information in this toolkit, these are overarching takeaways that come at the end of the toolkit that can provide sort of a North Star for work in this space. So I'm not going to walk through these takeaways here. You'll find a really helpful summary of these on the new conflict integration webpage that will be coming soon, as well as in the toolkit. But in short, they sort of provide a North Star for how we analyze, implement, adapt, and then strategically think about how we're engaging in these contexts. And with that, we can head to the next slide again. Perfect. So this is a map of Nigeria, and I just want to give a quick example of what it would look like to use the toolkit. So for instance, Nigeria is such an important country, but it also has overlapping and distinct kinds of fragility and violence taking place throughout the country. So the toolkit provides a general way to think about conflict integration in each of these contexts. So the content from across the program cycle, it applies to each geography, and it provides really excellent baseline tools for any context. But then it also provides a range of programming examples for diverse and specific needs. For instance, urban protests or election-related violence, farmer pastoralist conflict, and then violent extremist organizations, work in the CVE space. All of these are challenges that Nigeria is facing where you'd want more specific guidance on relevant programming types for that kind of context. And then finally, the mission case studies add value here too. So this is where we can take a step back again. You know, for instance, how could USAID Nigeria address these diverse contexts together? What have other missions done at the portfolio and strategic level? And what could it look like to knit those different problem sets back up together again? And with that, we can head to the next slide. Now, I'm going to give a quick example of one of the many programming examples you'll find in the toolkit. And this is an example of TERO-V, a water security and resilience activity under RISE 2 in Niger. Now, in Niger, 2/3 of conflict was related to farmer and pastoralist disputes. This sort of came up in the baseline research heading into this activity. And at the same time, there were national rules developed in the 1990s to guide natural resource management in the programming area where TERO-V would be operating that ended up disadvantaging pastoralists. So it was clear that meeting NRM goals was impossible without addressing conflict, and that they needed to address this conflict at all levels, from local to policy. So here's what they did. To make sure all people have equal access to resources, TERO-V worked to secure grazing land and animal quarters through participatory processes that brought all users together on how to manage resources. These processes led to really creative local conventions and bylaws between farmers and pastoralists to help them manage their shared resources. They then also relied on a popular local radio station to share this message and make sure that people who couldn't attend also were aware of what was going on. But then importantly, to think about that policy level, TERO-V also trained land commissions and supported new land tenure policies at the national level. And so in this way, you can see an excellent example of the arc to conflict sensitivity, the ways in which analyzing the conflict context, thinking about the two-way relationship between the activity and the context, and then adapting accordingly is so crucial. And this can really make sure that we're addressing these shared dynamics of peace, security, and sector goals like Feed the Future. It's it's by thinking about this cycle that you can see on the slide here, where we can really get to a place where we're both meeting our food goals and contributing to that more peaceful world. And with that, we can head to the next slide. I'm going to give a really quick example to wrap up of a mission case study. So this is, we're going to focus on Honduras here. In Honduras, the country context is that folks are managing drought, violence, and outmigration at the same time. And in light of these challenges, the mission decided to invest in a really robust violent and conflict assessment framework for the mission to be mission-wide, to really guide their work in this space. So we can head to the next slide. Now, the mission didn't just conduct a violence and conflict assessment framework. They wanted to make sure the entire mission was invested in understanding conflict and violence dynamics and integrating it throughout their work. So this was not a framework to sit on a shelf. The mission had a workshop to integrate findings from the assessment and make sure they were being applied across sectors. And we can head to the next slide. Now, next, what the mission did was to create a mission order on conflict sensitivity. This is basically a way to ensure conflict sensitivity is embedded into the DNA of the mission. This is a really exciting step to say that mission leadership is really invested in conflict sensitivity, and this needs to be seen as something that everyone is in the business of doing. And then after that, and I think perhaps the most exciting feature, is that the mission established a conflict sensitivity integration hub. Now, this is a really exciting model. The hub provides consistent training and a la carte analysis and support for mission colleagues when and where they need it on conflict sensitivity. So instead of everyone needing to become a conflict sensitivity expert, which honestly would not be the worst thing in the world, this is a model where you can really get that hands-on support and coaching. You can have meaningful relationships with the hub staff to be providing that intimate support day by day. And it's a way to get the right conflict sensitivity support when you need it in fast-moving environments where this kind of hub model is just really exciting. So we can head to the next slide now. That is all from me. That was sort of my overview of what you can find in the toolkit. I look forward to discussing it later, and I hope folks find it useful. But now, and importantly, we want to turn to partner speakers who can really bring to life the spirit behind the toolkit and the kinds of programming and challenging contexts that is doing that work to meet our resilience and food goals while also contributing to that more peaceful world. So first, we have Elizabeth Farmer, Chief of Party with Care with the Ethiopia. Chief of Party with Care Ethiopia with the Livelihoods for Resilience activity. Elizabeth, thank you so much for being with us. I'm just very grateful to you and your work, and over to you.
Thank you, Jessica. We can go to the first slide, and hello, everyone. I'm going to share with you from the Livelihoods for Resilience activity, which is a Feed the Future project that we've been implementing here in Ethiopia for the last 6.5 years, and in particular, our lessons learned in resilience from Ethiopia's northern conflict. Go to the next slide. Just to give you a little bit of background, Livelihoods for Resilience started at the end of 2016, and we've been working with over 97,000 households across Ethiopia. These are poor rural households in some of the kind of chronically food insecure parts of the country. You can see in the blue on the map that kind of Feed the Future, teal blue, the areas of northern Ethiopia and also southern Ethiopia where we've been working. We've been building resilience to shocks through livelihood interventions, women's empowerment, financial inclusion, nutrition, climate change adaptation, and market systems development, with a focus on promoting graduation from the government of Ethiopia's productive safety net program. So a very strong focus on resilience and helping rural households become resilient to shocks. But I'll be the first to confess that we weren't actually thinking about conflict shocks when this project was designed or when we kind of first started rolling it out. We were thinking particularly about climate shocks, drought. Again, these are some kind of marginal lands that folks are farming, and they face a lot of erratic rainfall and drought-related shocks. Conflict was, and definitely large-scale conflict was not something that we had kind of high on our minds at the beginning of the project, but it's what we kind of dealt with, and I'll be sharing how we adapted to that context. So we can go to the next slide. So the northern conflict started in 2020. It started in Tigray, which is the northern part, the very northern part of Ethiopia. It ended up cutting off the region from the rest of Ethiopia for 2 full years. It caused massive displacement, not only in Tigray, but also in neighboring Amhara, gender-based violence, and loss of assets and income. You can see this photo on the right it's the house of one of our project participants. I had, read in some assessments about households losing utensils and thought kind of had, knives and forks in my head. And I saw some of the impact here, and it's, some households lost absolutely everything, all their furniture, their livestock, all the way down to, yes, the knives and forks and spoons as well. The conflict also prevented farmers from harvesting crops, and in subsequent years from weeding and kind of tending to those crops as well. It disrupted market systems and all the usual flows of agricultural inputs into Tigray in particular, threatening to disrupt agricultural production and cause a major food security crisis in the region. And it led to a pausing of livelihoods for resilience implementation. I just described kind of what we were doing on financial inclusion and market systems development, access to finance, livelihood diversification, a lot of things that make a lot of sense to promote resilience, but aren't really things that you do in the middle of a conflict. So we had to pause implementation. And the conflict then expanded into Amhara region, just to the south of Tigray in July 2021. And there were several different waves back and forth on the conflict. Next slide. So you'll see here, the slide is how Livelihoods for Resilience laid the foundation for Brutesfa to be effective. Brutesfa is actually a separate project funded by BHA. So when the conflict first hit, or about 6 months into it, when we started thinking, okay, now we can go, now is a good time to start, responding in terms of livelihoods, we went looking for a crisis modifier and ended up finding a $13 million project funded by Brutesfa, funded by BHA, called Brutesfa. And we ended up layering that project right on top of Livelihoods for Resilience and implementing it through the Livelihoods for Resilience team rather than through kind of our separate humanitarian team, because we were the ones who had folks on the ground, quite a few of them, as you'll see in a second. And they weren't able to be implementing the Livelihoods for Resilience interventions at that time. So we ended up kind of taking on this additional project. Livelihoods for Resilience, again, a Feed the Future project, had been on the ground for 4 years. We had about 280 staff, most of whom were frontline staff on the ground in Tigray and the most impacted parts of Amhara. And we'd been working there with about 50,000 households. So about half of our overall project caseload was in those areas. And we had formed 2,800 village economic and social associations, or VESAs, which were the foundation of our project interventions. That foundation, if you look up on the higher part of the graph for Brutesfa, which started in 2021, so a few months after the start of the conflict, that enabled rapid startup, trust and relationships. We worked with and through the same local partners and technical partner that we'd been implementing Livelihoods for Resilience with. It enabled effective targeting. We had 50,000 already vulnerable households that we already had been working with, and good knowledge on the ground to target additional households. It also enabled continued implementation despite salary and payment gaps. There were periods with months at a time where we were unable to send up cash into Tigray in particular. We were carrying cash up in suitcases for a long time on UN flights. Months at a time, we were unable to do that. The staff continued to work. The vendors, the unions, the cooperatives, the agri-dealers that we were working with continued to supply the inputs that we were asking them to supply, even though it took us months to fulfill some of the payments. And that's due to the strong relationships that had been built over the previous 4 years. It also enabled us to do some kind of unusual things like identifying oxen owners to plow their neighbors' land. We found a lot of households had lost oxen. And one of the ways in which we decided to support plowing services was to identify existing oxen owners and figure out who around them needed support plowing and provide payments to then support both the oxen owners and their neighbors as well. The 4 years of technical knowledge and business skills that we had built through Livelihoods for Resilience helped enable the effective use of cash vouchers and in-kind inputs by households who received that support under Brutespa. They received various types of agricultural inputs, seed, fertilizer, cash for livelihoods investments, and also vouchers for various kinds of inputs. And the business skills that they had built over 4 years previously enabled them to use those wisely. And last but not least, we had a whole network of local entrepreneurs and local private sector that we've been working with, agri-dealers, pullet growers, feed processors, who we then worked with through a number of different voucher-based approaches. We provided fertilizer vouchers, those were actually with unions, vegetable seed and tool vouchers, and also poultry vouchers under Brutespa. Next slide. So we recently did resilience assessments in both Tigray and Amhara, and I wanted to share 3 resilience factors that we identified. The first one are these village economic and social associations, or VESAs. They're very similar to VSLAs. We found they're quite adaptive and provide critical support in times of crisis. Again, when we started them, we didn't think they would need to be adaptive to conflict, but we found that they had operated as sophisticated and adaptive financial institutions. They reduced the minimum savings amount. They had members who saved for other members. They repaid loans on behalf of other members. The VESAs rescheduled interest rate payments. They changed criteria for the prioritization of loans. And they did all of this and made all of these decisions on their own because they had several years of experience kind of adjusting to the circumstances. That's on the financial side. And then on the social side, they really provided a platform for communal support. They served as a source of informal insurance, with members helping each other. And we had some VESA members who reported that they were more likely to ask their fellow VESA members for support than even their own families or other community members who had more resources. We can go to the next slide. The second resilience factor is kind of a combination of livelihood diversification and engagement of local entrepreneurs. So we found that, under Livelihoods for Resilience, we had spent a lot of time diversifying livelihoods and giving households business experience. Brutespa then helped to protect those gains. And the engagement of local entrepreneurs and private sector helped enable the gains as well as protect them. So households had diversified their livelihoods into, off-farm and sheep fattening, poultry production, in some cases, dairy production. And we had a lot of households who were saying, I had diversified into these 3 or 4 livelihoods. I lost, my chickens all died and I lost my sheep, but I was able to keep my dairy cow, or I was able to continue my vegetable gardening. And that that sustained me throughout the conflict. And the experience with the business skills also helped households rebuild faster once they had lost everything. And the engagement of local entrepreneurs, the agri-dealers, they continue to supply inputs even after, kind of other typical, the cooperatives and unions were no longer active after a while, and they helped us implement a number of voucher-based interventions as well. And we can go to the next slide. Last but not least, the women's empowerment interventions that we did under Livelihoods for Resilience helped prepare women for the roles that they would need to play in the conflict. This is one of the less happy parts of resilience that we can talk about. Women were with the men were away, they were facing restricted mobility. If they were moving around, they might be mistaken for combatants. Women were the ones not just, obtaining inputs and going to the market, but also organizing funerals, helping their neighbors fill food gaps, providing support to other women in the community who'd faced rape and gender-based violence. They were also the ones managing household finances and making livelihood decisions. And these are exactly the kinds of things, at least the finances and livelihood decisions and the decision-making are the kinds of things that we had been helping to prepare them for under Livelihoods for Resilience. Through various trainings and gender norms discussions as well that we'd had at the community level and at the VESA level. We'll go to the next slide. These are some of the women who participate in our project, Tsege, Berhan, and Alemash. And I just want to share the story of Alemash here in the middle, the lady with the sheep. She's a Livelihoods for Resilience participant who actually has HIV and needed convincing to join the project because it requires joining a VESA and she didn't want to take a loan. She was worried that if she took a loan, she might die and pass on her debt to her children. But she participated in a number of trainings through Livelihoods for Resilience on women's empowerment, financial management, permagardening, sheep fattening, and ended up taking a nearly $1,000 loan to invest in sheep fattening. When the conflict hit, she had about 8 sheep that she was fattening for sale. Ethiopians eat a lot of meat around the holidays, so there's a kind of fattening cycle around holidays that makes sense. And she was fattening sheep for sale, but ended up being displaced by the conflict. And when she came back, all but one of her sheep had died, and that one was very weak. And she ended up having to stay inside her compound with her children for months on end as a result of the conflict, surviving off of some Swiss chard soup that she had from the Swiss chard that she had grown through the seeds that she had obtained through Brutesfa, kind of a mix of that and some wheat flour. But she was able to keep her remaining sheep alive, and it's since then had 2 lambs. Since the conflict ended, she's taken a new loan from her Vesa. She's bought a hen. She started engaging in poultry production. And she has kind of grand plans to, reinvest in sheep fattening as well, repay her microfinance loan, and take another loan. She's already restarted rebuilding her livelihoods, thanks to just the small kind of 1 sheep that she was able to keep alive during the conflict. You can go to the next slide. So just a few takeaways to share. This is my last slide. The first one is the VESA's livelihood diversification and business experience and women's empowerment are all critical to resilience. There are themes that kept coming up. We gathered the first set of stories from Tigray and then went to do resilience assessments in Amhara and found very, very similar stories of similar themes coming up. But all of these sources of resilience must be built over time. They're not things that we could have come up and introduced during the conflict. They were built for 4 years before the conflict hit. Secondly, the layering of humanitarian support on longer-term development interventions is highly effective, but sometimes it requires the stars to align. I think I'm not going to claim that we are the experts at integration, because I know we've struggled to layer and integrate with other projects, but when we're layering and integrating within our own team, it worked very well, and our development colleagues ended up being very good humanitarians as well, all the way down to the field level. Third, access to finance is critical to diversification. That kind of came up over and over in these stories, but it means now that loan rescheduling is going to be critical to bouncing back. And last but not least, vouchers contribute to household and market systems resilience. They keep both the market systems actors, the local agri-dealers, they keep them going, and they get the inputs into the hands of the farmers at the critical time. Thank you. Next
Elizabeth. Was that our final slide, Elizabeth?
Yes, I think it was.
Okay, perfect. Elizabeth, thank you so much. That was brilliant, and I know that we're going to have a lot of questions and a great conversation when we get to the moderated panel based on your work and then Olga's. But so with that, I am thrilled to introduce Olga Petriniak, Senior Director at Mercy Corps for the Resilience Portfolio. We had Elizabeth focus a bit more on really crisis-driven programming, where, maybe strong conflict integration wasn't the focus at the outset, but then tactics and approaches were discovered that really were impactful in the process, sort of in the midst of crisis. And Olga is going to share examples where there's a bit more lead time, a bit more time to be thinking intentionally and designing these activities on the front end. And so I'm looking forward to that. So Olga, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Jesse, for the introduction, and thanks to Elizabeth for that really incredible example of kind of leveraging and building on multi-year development platform for conflict response. And thanks to Resilience Links for having us here. So just as quick background, Mercy Corps is a multi-mandate organization. So we work across the humanitarian development and peace spectrum, primarily in fragile contexts where conflict and then climate change as well are mutually reinforcing and persistent threats to those sustained improvements in food security. And because of that, we apply a resilience framework across our programs. This means we focus on strengthening people's ability to cope with existing shocks at hand, proactively manage and adapt to future threats, and also address the power and social dynamics that perpetuate vulnerability to help people thrive. Next slide. I want to quickly underscore that conflict, as we just heard from Elizabeth and Jesse, is really part of the landscape everywhere that we work, even if it is not apparently visible. In many places, conflict-related shocks, whether violence, displacement, restrictions on freedom of movement, disruptions to markets, are the primary driver of hunger, malnutrition, and protracted humanitarian need. But in other areas, latent conflict, if not actively managed, can stall or suddenly undermine progress towards food security. So given this reality, we have in recent years kind of invested in a body of research and learning to understand what supports more resilient food security in conflict-affected environments. Next slide. And there have been three major takeaways from this research in terms of what really gets us there towards that more resilient food security in conflict settings. And today, I wanted to actually focus on the second two bullet points. So how do we support local markets and social systems to function as sources of resilience in conflict? And then also how we work on conflict management and mitigation efforts to prevent violence in the short term, while also then addressing those structural drivers of conflict. And I'm going to share three examples from USAID food security programs in the Africa region to illustrate these. So next slide. So my first example focuses on the Feed the Future rural resilience activity in the Beji areas, so Borno, Adamawa, Yobe, and Gombe in Northeast Nigeria. This is an area that is, of course, affected by persistent insecurity, violence, and displacement beginning in 2012 with the extremist insurgency. And these areas are today principal recipients of humanitarian aid. But RRA design is based on the premise that even in high conflict areas, economic activity and strong social connections are continuing and functioning. And these systems can be better strengthened to help people cope and adapt in a way that improves their food security and actually lays a foundation that allows them to emerge from the crisis. And I wanted to share this approach quickly through the story of Bata Peter Bwala. She's the woman here on your kind of at the front, wrapped with the black scarf. So 8 years ago, Bwata was displaced from Gwoza to Jere, 125 kilometers away from home because of the conflict. And she actually reported that at the time things were so bad, she actually thought of tragically ending her own life. Today, she is a major cowpea trader and an investor. So how does one get there in the midst of conflict? Through RRA in 2020, along with a group of other women, Bata was introduced to VSLA, which named the Alheri Savings Groups. And the group was regularly supported in the VSLA methodology through a trained mentor who they now pay. That VSLA enabled Bata to start trading and process cowpea with capital funds of less than $10. Importantly, Bata's business experienced many shocks, including during COVID. And so she received nearly a $200 cash transfer through a crisis modifier to a new bank account she opened at a Fidelity bank due to her participation in the VSLA. She used that money to buy food, but also to expand her business to start processing cowpea herself. And through market linkages with vendors facilitated by the program, she added new customers, she increased her sales by 100% and expanded her trade outside the wider Jeddah and Maiduguri area. But the story does not end with Bata. She then introduced this cowpea processing business to her savings group, which grew into a registered cooperative. They received a cow processing machine. They were linked with the National Director for Employment and the Standards Organization of Nigeria that supported them on business management, standardization, safe food handling. And many of the women now have diverse markets trading locally, but also internationally to Cameroon. What's critical, and I think this echoes from Elizabeth's story as well, that in this protracted crisis, the women's savings groups and their savings are also a critical safety net for women facing shocks in their household. And importantly, that group cowpea business currently provides a key platform for the women to expand their economic and social networks, bring cohesion and community by including both IDPs and host community members. It offers a space for sharing ideas, market price information, and a critical conduit for individual skill development. Next slide. So what is the conflict story here, you may ask? So Bata's story is a testament to how sustained, profitable economic activity and social connections can be supported and improved, even in highly conflict-affected areas or protracted crises. It shows that this type of support mechanisms also then reinforce local food systems. And importantly, RRA has been able to do this at scale, and you can see some of the initial results here. But I wanted to draw your attention to the following takeaways or conclusions on how to support resilient food security in conflict settings. So first, in conflict areas with fragile markets, we really see the need to still understand that private sector exists. It's just that we have to understand them as the last mile, small scale micro enterprises. These are the primary market actors who can support the foundation for vibrant local economies in conflict settings. Second, both facilitating market linkages for those last mile actors while injecting cash responses that support them through crises can help them navigate those disruptions, both conflict and not conflict related, to continue to thrive. And importantly, economic activity, if structured in an inclusive way, in this case across host and displaced communities, can strengthen bonds and social connections that are also fundamental to helping people cope and adapt in conflict zones. Next slide. I now want to turn your attention to South Kivu in the DRC, where we have done even more to intentionally integrate conflict management in a program designed to strengthen climate resilient agricultural production. And this is the BHA-funded food security program. So South Kivu in DRC is an area rife with conflict along clan and community lines between land managers and sharecroppers and herders and farmers, multiple militia groups fighting for control of territory, you name it. And a key conflict driver is actually increased competition over productive land, which is linked to community, clan, and political affiliations. And this is particularly true for those relying on hillside production. Now here, climate change is also an exacerbating factor. So erratic rainfall patterns and heavier rain are causing erosion and floods, reducing fertile land coverage and lowering productivity, and then reinforcing resource-based conflict. At the same time, conflict, insecure land tenure, kind of mistrust among these groups means that tenants or tenant farmers are unwilling to invest in more productive climate resilient ag practices that will result in ag productivity and yield. So it's creating this negative feedback loop. Next slide. So to address improved land management and agricultural productivity in this conflict environment, the work actually began with a governance and conflict management approach. So the program brought together landowners, land managers, local authorities, and tenant farmers around the table to start to a dialogue and unpack these conflicts and social dynamics. And through this process, they supported the establishment of COCOVs or Green Hill Committees, if you were to break down the acronym in French, which were charged with better hillside planning, governance, and land management. And through a facilitated process, COCOVs were supported to be more inclusive, representative to diverse groups and interests on the Hill. Also underneath the COCOV, the program supported dialogue and mediation committees responsible for addressing land disputes. And our local partner, Action pour la Paix et Concorde, sorry, I'm not a French speaker, so hopefully that pronunciation came across okay. And so through that local partner, we strengthened these group dispute resolution, the group's dispute resolution and mediation capacity. So the COCOV, coupled with the mediation capacity of the DMC, kind of created a space for dialogue and negotiation platforms around land-based conflicts across sharecroppers, land managers, and landowners. Next slide. So this process set the stage actually for two really critical results. It allowed the COCOV to negotiate longer-term written contracts for tenant farmers and sharecroppers, as well as clear agreements around land management and use. And this in turn incentivized longer-term, more sustainable land management practices. Second, it allowed the COCOV to work together with all the tenant farmers on a climate resilient agricultural design along the hill, which included each farmer implementing a set of soil and water conservation practices intercropping that benefited their own piece of land, but also supported the productivity of the whole hill. And of course, as mentioned, the tenant farmers now had incentives to engage in this because of those longer term contracts. And as a result, we saw these practices improve soil and water fertility, agricultural productivity, and of course, food security. And importantly, the COCOV continues to serve as this land management planning and management body for the hill, and the DMC continues to resolve disputes. Next slide. So the last example, just 2 more minutes, comes from our Feed the Future funded activity in Ethiopia, RIPA North, which actually we implement with CARE, my co-presenter. RIPA North is focused on market systems change in pastoral and agro-pastoral areas, coupled with nutrition outcomes, and also seeks to improve natural resource and disaster risk management towards food security. So we talked about the conflict in Tigray, but RIPA's operational areas are also rife with interethnic, inter-clan, and cross-border conflicts. These conflicts have been increasingly politicized. There are also very real identity-based, natural resource management-based conflicts that are affecting land productivity for livestock and crops. Next slide. So RIPA in its program has very deliberately identified conflict hotspots on which it focuses and where it really sees a critical potential disruption to its long-term programming. And it has built in conflict sensitivity into its approach, and also leveraged additional funding and developed a very targeted TOC towards addressing conflicts and promoting peace building. And it really focuses on the primary premise that senior decision makers, both formal government decision makers, formal authorities, as well as informal governance structures, regularly make and implement decisions without consideration of conflict dynamics. And therefore, this exacerbates violence and other tensions in the areas that are identified. And therefore, the program has therefore incorporated conflict sensitivity, negotiation, mediation, skill building at various levels, including as part of its NRM and DRM planning at community level, as well as with government officials with which it regularly works. And we are beginning to see the dividends of this work, particularly around the most recent drought, where there was substantial movement across border communities and kind of groups, areas with different ethnic groups, where communities were moving for water and grazing lands, which were a flashpoint of conflict. And through the conflict sensitivity analysis, local leaders began to map these flashpoints. Government authorities did as well. They identified potential tensions, but they also created very deliberate resource sharing agreements for the drought. More importantly, they actually worked with communities to cascade these decisions down to the last mile, so everybody had a shared understanding and understood the implication of potential violent outbreaks. With these 3 examples, I will stop here. And just to conclude with the point that it is possible and it is imperative to work on resilient food security in conflict settings, both by supporting the local systems that help people cope and adapt in conflict, but also tackling conflict head-on through mediation, management, and prevention efforts that are integrated into food security programs. I'll stop there.
Olga, thank you so much for that presentation. I'm sure you haven't been tracking because you've been busy presenting, but there's a lot of excellent questions coming through the chat. So at this stage, I'm going to welcome Elizabeth and Olga to join me on camera. Or Olga, you might have a connection issue, so we'll just join you by voice if that's what's possible right now. But we're going to head into an open Q&A period. We do have some moderated Q&A questions from myself, but there are so many coming in through the chat that I want to make sure we have ample time to answer everyone's questions. And there was a theme. There was one thing I wanted to share, which is that there's a theme with some questions around conflict sensitivity. And I'm realizing that in focusing on the toolkit, we didn't do a primer on what is conflict sensitivity. What does it mean to be integrating conflict? So I'm going to give just like a super quick summary. Conflict sensitivity has 3 key steps to it. It's about understanding the context, the two-way relationship between the context and intervention, and adapting accordingly. And in doing so, we're going to be minimizing negative impacts and really promoting opportunities for peace in our work. And someone asked a question that I just wanted to, engage with right away, which is like, oh, is this about, is this for when you're in the midst of conflict or in a conflict setting? And in short, conflict sensitivity is critical with every single intervention in the aid world. It's absolutely imperative that we're conflict sensitive in everything we do. However, the stakes are even higher, and it's more essential than ever when we are leaning into some of these fragile and conflict affected and violent settings where there's just even more at stake. The political economy, the conflict dynamics are just so profound, and there can just be even starker consequences for people's lives without taking it seriously. But ideally, every single intervention would be conflict sensitive. So I don't know if that helps or hurts, but I wanted to flag that as we kick off. And with this, I would love to dig into some of the questions. So my first question is for Elizabeth. I'm wondering, because you gave such an excellent kind of just narrative of how you'd have to adapt, in the midst of crisis when these kinds of challenges weren't expected. I'm curious if you wanted to share more on any major hurdles you had to sort of overcome with adaptive management, what kinds of adaptive management approaches you might have leaned on, and sort of what happened and what did you do in that context?
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, it's interesting because, obviously the first adaptation was kind of in response to the conflict itself, kind of figuring out what we were going to do, how we were going to design Brutesfa and the interventions to get agricultural inputs to the households. But even throughout the subsequent 2 years, there were constant adaptations that were required, constant changes in the situation, because it's not just about active conflict, it's also about access. And which roads were open at which time. Was it possible to get inputs in kind into the region? Were inputs already there that we could then give people vouchers to receive? Was it possible to get cash out there? Were the banks operating? They stopped operating about 8 months into the conflict and just restarted, kind of a few months ago. So we were constantly shifting. We had an initial design on, some inputs to be provided through vouchers, others through in kind, and others through cash. And there was a shift within that. We've always wanted to provide as many inputs through vouchers as we can, because of kind of this double impact on the household and the local private sector, or these last mile service providers, as Olga was mentioning. But occasionally we had, so the first year fertilizer was in the region, for example, so we provided fertilizer vouchers to support households in accessing that fertilizer. The second year, the region didn't get its allocation, so we had to send it up in kind. We had cash planned and ended up having to provide, there kind of shifts in different modalities according to the situation. But then also in terms of our own kind of management and relationship with the staff, flights weren't going for a while, and telephone services were shut off. So not only could we not communicate with our teams in the field, but they couldn't communicate with each other, which makes it very difficult to implement a program. We also couldn't send cash up. Our local partner was unable to pay its staff for months on end. And so to kind of kill multiple birds with one stone, we thought, okay, why don't we have district level review meetings every month where, there's this kind of a set schedule, the staff come together, they know what's going to happen. They talk about kind of what's been accomplished, the upcoming activities. This is kind of several dozen staff within each district within Tigray. And then also they then got per diem to come to those meetings for a couple of days, which then helped sustain them, to some extent during periods when they weren't receiving their salaries. So kind of trying to adapt, every couple of weeks and months, it seemed like the implementing environment was shifting. And we started out in Tigray and then it expanded into Amhara and we had to bring in another partner. Areas shifted administration as well. So places under one region's administration went under another region's administration. We had to shift implementation modalities there. But I think, again, the relationships with the local partners that had been built over kind of a number of years, and then a good flexibility, on behalf of, our own leadership in country and then USAID as well, enabled that to kind of happen more smoothly than it could have in other contexts. Thanks.
Awesome, Elizabeth, thank you. And I wanted to turn to Olga next with a question, because, we've all given examples from different contexts, but we haven't quite dug into, the phrase conflict or conflict sensitivity. It might mean, might make you think we're talking about one thing when actually we know there's just so many different kinds of violence and conflict contexts, from gang activity to militia groups to a proper, formal civil war to all sorts of different spaces in between. And or a fragile context where corruption is really high and there's certain kinds of patronage networks and what that looks like, et cetera. There's just so many contexts that we're actually navigating. So for Olga, I'm wondering if you can just share a bit more, if you can like open that black box for us and just share what your thoughts are on conflict sensitivity across these diverse conflict and violence contexts, and maybe it ties into with work you've been doing recently in this space. Over.
Apologies. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Great. Thanks for that question, Jesse. Yeah, I will say, I was reflecting on, Elizabeth's example and kind of being deeply familiar with Ethiopia and the Tigray conflict and thinking about, how do we foster social cohesion? How do we build social connections? And how do we continue to strengthen markets? And, in the midst of those kind of crises, and the reality is, sometimes the conflict is so severe that when we are really inactive and in such brutal conflict, we can't. But there is at least an imperative to apply conflict-sensitive humanitarian action in those circumstances. So, no matter how much we may seek to avoid that conflict, all of the actors who are operating in such environments, as the Northern conflict, are somehow part of that landscape. And so it is inadvertently, it's critical that we inadvertently don't do harm. And I would just say that in those contexts, when we're really in an active war zone, so to speak, at a minimum, we need to conduct the ongoing conflict analysis to understand what the dynamics are between groups. We need to kind of maintain that regular two-way communication with communities. And we need to adapt our programming really to at least minimize harm and strengthen opportunities for peace. Now, that is challenging to do, but I think the way Elizabeth has described it in terms of building on that development platform was really, really impressive. I do want to say that at the same time, we have seen that even in active conflict environments, there is an opportunity to promote dialogue, promote social connections, and to continue to strengthen market activity. And I think we just need to go into those areas with eyes wide open and look for those opportunities. And again, I think Elizabeth's example, even though it wasn't originally a conflict program, was such a strong example of still trying to identify and work through and with those last mile market actors to somehow keep local economies and local systems going, even as we were delivering, or as CARE was delivering in this case, critical humanitarian aid. And I would just argue that just monitoring the context and trying to look for a space to try and build in mechanisms for dispute resolution, for strengthening social cohesion and dialogue. Those things, we have to kind of look at opportunities to do that, even in kind of active conflict settings, and we have had success with that, while at the same time promoting and supporting market activity through market-led actors. And obviously in more stable contexts, I mean, we have that opportunity to to really transform and address those root causes, really looking at broader economic inclusion. But even in those cases, we need to be very actively understanding the dynamics and making sure that the way we work with market actors, the way we work on broader economic development does not exacerbate grievances and does not do harm. I'll stop there.
Awesome. Olga, thank you. Thank you for that. I'm wondering, well, I'd like to dig into some of those examples of what that can look like in a second. And we have some really good questions that get into that. I thought I would take one question quickly that's a bit more directed towards me. So someone's asked, is any attention being given by Feed the Future to prevent conflicts through reviewing development policies and programs with a do no harm perspective? And I just wanted to share, in this vein, I think it was really exciting that the new global food security strategy that we have that was launched in the fall, it includes a new goal around conflict integration. And so that's sort of a first with the Feed the Future initiative. And then through that process, there's actually new activity design guidance on conflict integration through the Feed the Future initiative. But that's a shorter document. It's about 10 pages. And this toolkit is really aiming to be this more robust resource to be really mainstreaming conflict sensitivity and conflict considerations throughout Feed the Future. And part of the sort of indicators that we have will include we'll have indicators in this space as well. So that's sort of the trajectory and where we're at right now. But it'll be a journey. It'll be a journey from having that goal to having resources to then really ensuring that this is mainstream through new activities that come online. And with that, I wanted to turn to, because we have a lot of questions, I wanted to go back to Elizabeth. There was one question about a recommendation on livelihood interventions that are relatively resilient to conflict for the future. And I feel like it's tricky. I feel like in this conversation where maybe we continue to say specific context matters so much, et cetera, but then on the other hand, we do want to be able to learn from other contexts and have takeaways from there. So yeah, with that, Elizabeth, over to you. I'm curious if you found through your work in Ethiopia, if certain livelihoods seem to be kind of more resilient to conflict, so to speak, and maybe more promising when thinking about programming in other places. Over.
Thanks. I think, the broader response, I think from my side is really the livelihood diversification is the key. I think if you're diversifying into 4 different types of livelihoods, it's not necessarily easy to predict which ones are going to be resilient to what, and conflict isn't the only thing that you're also worrying about, and the direct impact of the conflict isn't the only thing. So I think generally speaking, I would say the livelihood diversification and the business experience are really the most important part. I think we've also seen, in the conflict, so that, some livelihoods are more maybe resilient to displacement than others. Chickens are not very resilient to displacement. If you leave them, they will die. You also can't take all your sheep with you if you are fleeing to the bush, or it's very inconvenient. To kind of take all your livestock assets that may be critical, really, instrumental to resilience at other times, it's really hard to take them with you. We heard some surprising stories of dairy cows being really critical to resilience. The farmers left behind, the sheep and the chickens, but they took the dairy cow. It's a lot easier to lead one dairy cow, somewhere and then lead it back. It kind of takes quite a bit to feed it. So I think there are different dynamics at play there. It's also, it's obviously hard in a conflict context to get animal health services, to get veterinary drugs and vaccines. Veterinary drugs are something that we worked on through Brutesfa. I think, the different dynamics in there. We found, one of the things that we supported, we had trained households in perma-gardening under Livelihoods for Resilience. We hadn't provided any seeds, but then we gave households seed vouchers, vegetable seed vouchers under Brutesfa. And we actually found that during, especially the worst parts of the conflict, when when people were afraid to leave their compounds, those vegetables really sustained them because they could grow it right there inside their, they're on their little family plot and harvest it and eat it without fearing, without needing to kind of go to the market or travel further, either to buy food or to plow kind of a larger area of land. But I do think, the specific livelihoods would be quite context specific and related to whether, you have kind of a lot of displacement or access constraints. But I think, again, kind of to conclude, it's really the diversification. You can't possibly predict what's going to happen. And I think the more different types of livelihoods a household has experience with, and the more experience they have with business, I think, people are smart. They'll find business opportunities. They'll adapt to the changing circumstances and say, okay, I can't go to the market, but I can sell, this milk to my neighbor, or I can do this, I can survive off of this for now until I'm able to get that. The more they have experience, the more they'll be able to find those solutions for themselves, I think, when the conflict hits. And I think that's a lot of the resilient stories that we heard were those types of experience and those types of stories. Thanks.
Elizabeth, thank you for that. I want to pick up on that thread, but also come back to something Olga was mentioning in her last response, which is around that more kind of intensive humanitarian crisis moment where cash transfers might be a prominent piece to the landscape. So we have one question that says, you have all spoken about cash programming in conflict settings. Can you speak about any of the conflict sensitivity issues specific to cash programming that you've encountered and how your organization identified and addressed them? So I'm also, happy for Elizabeth to chime in afterwards, but I wanted to direct this to Olga. So yeah, thank you, Olga.
Thanks, Jesse, for that question, and to whoever posed it. So, for sure, with cash, I think that the major issues obviously around perceptions of who is getting it, why they were chosen, who is targeting who benefits more broadly. And we've seen that cash can actually very quickly exacerbate tensions or perceptions of marginalization, for example, between IDPs and host communities, where IDPs are somehow seen as potentially more vulnerable and therefore more targeted with cash specifically and other humanitarian assistance. I mean, often inadvertently, again, because of targeting, we can be perceived as giving cash to one clan or one ethnic group over another. And even if that's not the way the targeting is done, again, it's just the perceptions that are created through that work. And I think it's also really important to remember that cash is not just, something that the household will use immediately for their own immediate benefit, but also is a broader sort of currency that households use to build social connections and wider social support networks. And therefore, again, it's kind of who wins and who loses in cash responses, and the perceptions that are created around that can really drive further tensions and even create exclusion and different dynamics within the community, if not like outright violence. So, I mean, I think if I were to say how have we managed this, it's just, an ongoing conflict. But when we say conflict analysis, really a relationship and perception analysis. Do we understand, which group actors identify with, who is the other, how do they perceive their relationship with other groups, and what are their perceptions about those other groups? And I think that's a really critical piece to kind of take account in our programming in general, not just in cash programming. I think we also may often have to really broaden our criteria of who we target with cash response and understand that, again, taking that do no harm approach might mean targeting, across a broader spectrum of vulnerability, not just, what we understand in our criteria for the most vulnerable. And that includes market actors, right? As I mentioned before, I think really looking at market actors and targeting them with cash assistance so they can continue to broaden their businesses and the goods and services they provide to communities is essential. And I think through cash response, we also have to, again, look at that. Sometimes it may not be possible, but we really have to actively look for every opportunity to try to strengthen relationships. Can we build relationships between the local trader who might be from one, ethnicity or clan group with others in that community? Can we actively build those market linkages? Can we work on kind of dialogue as part of our cash transfer activities and connect cash recipients to kind of learn about their experience of conflict and start to dialogue with each other? So I would just say those are some of the considerations that I think we have to bring in to really make sure our cash responses are conflict sensitive, but also lay the foundation for building social connections and social cohesion.
Olga, thank you so much for that answer. It does make me wonder, when you're describing those approaches and practices, what is the enabling environment or support you would need, for instance, from a donor agency to facilitate that kind of work, to implement in the way you probably need to get to meet the goals you have and to do things as thoughtfully and in a conflict sensitive manner. And so I guess in a way I'm putting myself in the hot seat a little bit, but I think there's this question of, what are some of these kind of needs from a donor agency like USAID to facilitate this kind of work? And that could include practices that were helpful, so I actually might start with Elizabeth with this question. I'm curious if there are certain needs and necessary conditions that you may or may not have had in the past, or if there's examples of just like promising ways a donor can be supporting your work that you would ideally want to see done more broadly or by other donors. Over.
Thanks. It's interesting because in many ways, I think in our interactions with USAID, we found it a lot easier to do cash than to do in-kind inputs, because it's a lot fewer prior approvals for cash transfers. And actually a couple of times when we weren't able to, we've shifted from in-kind inputs to cash when something wasn't going to be able to happen in time, either the USAID approval or the procurement and transport of the input. We're like, okay, here's some cash, specifically for these inputs. I think, what we saw with USAID, both BHA and the mission was really a responsiveness to the local context. And so when we first started saying we wanted to do livelihood recovery cash transfers, they were saying, they were initially saying, are you sure? Are the markets working? We went and we did a market assessment. We were inclined initially to do livelihood recovery cash transfers. Cash transfers they're great for livelihood recovery, right? Because if you can't plan in advance for every type of livelihood a household is engaging in and give them exactly the types of inputs that they, oh, you need some chickens, oh, you need some sheep, oh, you were doing off farm, here's some stuff to go sell over there. Cash enables households to say, okay, I'm gonna, in the current context, the best way to make money is this, so I'm going to go invest in that. And what we found was, cash transfers, if the banks are working, people appreciate cash transfers also because they're discreet, and everybody doesn't see you coming home with a big bag of something. It's just the money sitting in your account when you're ready to go and invest. Lower risk of looting or kind of security concerns. You don't have to stand in line on distribution day. You could just go and wait. But I think again, so we've used cash transfers for livelihood recovery, but it's really kind of in conversations with USAID. And we have the DART that we've worked with here and kind of engaged with us in figuring out and kind of going back and forth on some of our plans. And we ended up, shifting to and from cash, I would say, in different circumstances. I had another point, but I forgot it. So I'll just leave it at that for now. Thanks.
Well, if you remember, I'll turn to Olga now, but if you remember, let's go back to Elizabeth. Thanks.
Thanks, Jesse. I apologize. I'm on two devices because I have to speak on my phone due to my connection, and I keep unmuting the wrong one. So sorry to the 100 people on this webinar for the feedback. Okay, so just what can we ask from donors? And it's interesting, Jesse, because it's going to be a little bit of donors holding us to account a little bit. I think what we're finding is that conflict analysis and integration of conflict sensitivity and management is there in sometimes in the language and peppered throughout, but it's really not a primary component that we're asked to focus on. And often we are not held to, report on it and to really integrate it in a meaningful way. I think this is particularly true, actually, in humanitarian programming. I find that maybe we're evolving, but I'm not sure to the extent to which the current BHE guidelines really hold us to account on integrating conflict sensitivity in humanitarian action and prioritize that. And furthermore, to what extent, is conflict mitigation and management really integrated into kind of some of these larger programs? We see it there, but again, it's often an afterthought. And it's not a major requirement. And so I would really encourage that it's seen as a really critical and essential component of this programming, particularly if we approach it with, a resilience lens. It should take sort of as prominent of a role as climate change adaptation and looking at other disaster risks, which, thankfully are now really, really at the forefront of a lot of these programs. But these things go hand in hand from my perspective. I also, just to Elizabeth's point, is I think with conflict landscapes, we really need that flexibility and that ability to manage adaptively and to respond, and the extent to which funding can be layered or adjusted or allowed to pivot in its scope to respond to conflict dynamics as they evolve, I think is also something that's really welcome. Actually, kind of going back to the conflict analysis and holding, agencies to account, I think we need to really see conflict shocks managed very clearly in the theory of change, and sort of those conflict indicators again come out. And the final thing I wanted to say is, and this is a bit more subtle, and again is maybe more in our space, in the donor space, but the same way there's really been a push around broader gender and social inclusion issues in terms of staffing, organizational structures and norms. We really need to see that also come out in terms of broader conflict sensitivity around inclusion in staffing structures and organizations. So, in our humanitarian action, how are we staffing for diversity and ensuring that we're kind of not exacerbating certain key conflict dynamics through the way that we staff in our particular programs. So I'll leave it there.
Olga, I really appreciate that. I think it's a fitting message as we kind of round towards the end of the webinar for partners and donors alike to be bold in this space. We know this work is so important, and we're kind of on a journey of advancing the plot in greater conflict sensitivity across our work. But I like that. I think, the marching orders for everyone to be leaning in this space. And so with that, I actually wanted to go back to you, Olga, for a question. We have a question from the audience that I think you have some exciting programming examples on. The question is, can you talk more about breaking the negative feedback loops that are preventing farmers from engaging with input providers in a conflict setting? But then I know there was a previous question too that was just about how farmer behavior is affected by their expectation of future violence. And so I don't know if there's either a programming example or just some thoughts about how you break up that negative feedback loop when it exists and get to a different outcome. So over to you. And then after that, because I just wanted to signpost the kind of time we have left, I'm going to ask a couple questions to both Elizabeth and Olga that I think are a bit shorter. They're just kind of like technical questions about maybe the examples or presentations. So we'll go through those. I then have one last question for Olga and Elizabeth, and then we're going to head over to closing remarks. So with that, Olga, thanks, and over to you for this question about feedback loops.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that in these contexts where we're working on sort of, farmer behavior, farmer herder relationships, land productivity, again, conflict management and inclusive governance has to be kind of the foundation for that work. There are historic relationships, current perceptions that exist that are very fluid and dynamic in these kind of contexts where communities rely primarily on agricultural livestock production, where there's high resource competition. And so we really have to begin with kind of fundamental governance and peace building approaches, and that's kind of, I think, the example that was shared from DRC, where we look at, intra-community dialogue, safe spaces for people to express what are their current perceptions of the other, who is the other, what are their views, and start to identify maybe shared interests, get them to a space where they're actually maybe able to deal with the trauma that they've experienced from violence and prepare them for dialogue. And, do that with all the different groups and then bring them together, under a shared platform, for dialogue, to express issues, to express grievances. And from there, people are really at a place where they can start to engage in sort of participatory development or community development. But often we throw people into that space when there's all these underlying deep-seated issues that really haven't had a chance to come out. So I would really, not to oversimplify it, but really using very well-facilitated dialogue, trauma healing processes as the approaches to then start to engage in participatory and inclusive governance, where only at that point we start to bring local authorities around the table, village chiefs, and others to try and tackle some of these issues head on, recognizing that if we do, through those dialogues, farmers and herders start to really realize that they only have to gain, right? That their yields will be higher, that they will have more steady access to markets, that cooperation with groups that they previously were in tension with will actually kind of get them further. But I would say, maybe to your point, Jesse, about what do we need from donors, is also the time to do that work and the space. We have to understand that, again, this is a foundation of not just peace programming, but food security and broader economic growth programming. And the space has to be very intentionally created to do that.
Olga, thank you for that. I'm going to try to fit in 2 more questions but before we head into closing remarks. And so my next one is for Elizabeth. I'm noting we've focused more on intercommunal conflict in this conversation, and we haven't talked about interpersonal violence yet. So I have a question about GBV from the audience for Elizabeth. The question is, how did the project counter GBV issues within the conflict period? And so Elizabeth, over to you on that.
Thanks. That was quite a challenging one. We did an initial kind of cash markets and gender assessment about 6 months into the conflict, and found really high rates of gender-based violence, rape, and trauma as a result of that. Initially we did an initial kind of round of psychosocial support, in particular for staff. I think this gets back to what the kind of the deep-seatedness of the trauma that Olga was mentioning as well. And I think from our side, the staff, we have a lot of frontline staff in these communities who are experiencing the same types of things that our project participants were experiencing. And so we provided psychosocial support and kind of psychological first aid training for the staff. And then, a lot of our interventions were just mostly focused on kind of what are some safe things to provide to households where people don't have to move very far. They don't have to, come to a distribution that is far away at a time that is really, kind of when they don't feel safe, interventions close to home, minimizing things like meetings that kind of just movement was unsafe for men and women for different reasons for a long time. And so really trying to not kind of call people for all sorts of unnecessary things. There wasn't a lot that could be done, to address the gender-based violence during this conflict because it was being, perpetrated by troops from both sides, and not in a way that there was much that we could do to kind of prevent it or address it when it was happening. I think what we're trying to work on now, we're doing another round of psychosocial support, and this time focusing in addition to the staff on some of the households themselves and trying to kind of start those processes of trauma healing. But the frontline staff and the community members themselves, I think, did a lot to kind of help women get medical support, kind of get, in many cases, the medical support that they needed at those times. And I think those were, it feels, I have to say, confess, it feels quite inadequate to the scale of what these women faced during the conflict. And now our programming is ending, but it's something we're looking at, I think, in other programming as well within care, because there's a lot there that I think is going to take a long time to heal, and there's a lot to be done to kind of help facilitate that process. So that's my highly unsatisfactory answer.
Elizabeth, thank you for that. I mean, I think if the answer is we can be doing more, and we hope to do more in the future, maybe that's good too. As we all navigate this space, it's such challenging work. And I know I wanted to say a huge thank you to Olga and Elizabeth. So we're actually wrapping up our panel, our Q&A time. And I know I am just so grateful for both of you sharing your work and your thoughts in this space. We have a bunch of questions we still didn't get to answer, and so maybe we can follow up over email. But otherwise, I'm just very grateful to you both for your time today and your insights. We are now going to be turning to closing remarks from another USAID colleague. So I'm going to introduce Daniel Abrams, Climate Security Advisor with the Center for Conflict and Violence Prevention at USAID. I know at the outset of this session, I thanked Duke University for their partnership with this toolkit, but I had a big omission there, which is that CVP colleagues, Daniel in particular, were really instrumental to the success of this product. It's so important for us to be collaborating across our bureaus and areas, and so to have Daniel and team from our Bureau for Conflict Prevention and Stabilization working with folks in the Center for Resilience and the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, it's really essential to be able to deliver products like this. So thank you, Daniel and team, CVP colleagues, for collaborating on the toolkit. And with that, Daniel, over to you. Thank you for closing us out.
Thanks, Jesse, and thanks, Elizabeth and Olga. This was really wonderful. I took a lot from it, and obviously based on the questions, there was incredible engagement and folks learning a lot as well. So there's a lot, I think, left to think about. I think, as Jesse noted up top, 8 of the 10 most severe food crises in 2019 were in conflict-affected places, and that fundamentally there is a moral and strategic imperative to bridge our efforts around conflict intervention, around food security, and around climate change, which was my focus. And both Olga and Elizabeth gave incredible examples of how development can integrate these concerns, and I was struck by a number of things, not the least of which was how the programs incorporated broader systems related to social structures, related to economic structures, related to hyper-localized gender issues, as being central to part of those programs. And I think what I want to underscore is that is a difficult and intensive thing to do. And I think one of the real value adds of the Feed the Future toolkit and similar toolkits that USAID has worked on, including the Land and Conflict toolkit, including the Water and Conflict toolkit, both of which are also available, is that it does provide something of a manual to how we can approach these issues, which again are really difficult development challenges. So as folks on this webinar start approaching those resources, I'll remind you both that it is challenging, and that these resources might offer specific interventions or specific answers all across development design and implementation and monitoring and evaluation. So really appreciate the inputs and the lessons, and really appreciate the ability to close this out. And with an eye for time, I'm gonna turn this back over to you, Jesse, and thank everybody for their time and attention.
Awesome, Daniel. Thank you so much for joining and for the closing remarks. And I am just here to say a very quick thank you to everyone, Daniel, Olga, and Elizabeth as our speakers, CVP and Duke colleagues for supporting the Toolkit, our Resilience Links team, and very importantly, all of the participants for all of your wonderful engagement and questions. And yeah, we look forward to continuing the conversation. Please feel free to reach out if you have additional questions on this conflict integration and FTF food security issue set. And please stay tuned for the Resilience Links webpage that will be coming soon to just provide really user-friendly, accessible links and resources in this space. And I also hope you enjoy the Feed the Future toolkit. And with that, we will close. Please stay tuned for the next Resilience Links theme month coming up next month for both the newsletter and the webinar. And otherwise, thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.